August 1943. A train rattled to a stop in the scorching Texas heat. 50 German prisoners stumbled into the dust, half dead, braced for brutality. They'd been told Americans were monsters, that prisoners would be beaten, starved, treated like animals. But what they saw shattered everything the Third Reich had taught them. A tall black man in a Stetson hat stood calm before them, holding the reins of a beautiful horse. Beside him, a Mexican-American guard tipped his hat with quiet respect. No snarling, no rifles pointed, just dignity. One prisoner whispered in disbelief, "They let them carry guns?" These battle-hardened soldiers couldn't believe their eyes. The enemies they were taught to despise were about to teach them what honor truly meant. But before we continue, if you want to hear more incredible untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far these stories reach. Klaus Hoffmann had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the long voyage across the Atlantic, packed into the hold of a transport ship with hundreds of other captured Wehrmacht soldiers. In his mind, the arrival always ended the same way, with screaming guards, rifle butts, maybe worse. The propaganda films he'd watched in training had been clear about what happened to German soldiers in American hands. They would be treated like vermin, worked to death, starved for sport. It was what happened to enemies of inferior races, to prisoners of a soft, mongrel nation that didn't understand true strength. But as his boots hit the Texas dust on that blistering August afternoon in 1943, Klaus found himself facing something his 22 years of life had not prepared him for. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the air thick and shimmering. Cotton fields stretched endlessly in every direction, white bowls nodding in a hot breeze that offered no relief. Wooden barracks rose behind coils of barbed wire, exactly as grim as he'd expected. The other prisoners stumbled around him, some limping from old wounds, others simply hollow-eyed from the journey and the shock of capture. They'd been soldiers of the Third Reich. Now they were nothing. Klaus squinted against the glare, waiting for the brutality to begin, waiting for the proof that everything he'd been taught was true. Instead, he saw a man who made no sense at all. The guard stood perhaps 20 paces away, tall and lean, wearing an American Army uniform and a wide-brimmed Stetson hat that looked like it belonged in a picture show about the Wild West. His skin was dark as polished mahogany, his posture relaxed but alert, one hand resting easy on the reins of a beautiful quarter horse that stood beside him with the patient stillness of an animal that trusts its handler completely. The guard wasn't shouting, wasn't sneering, wasn't even watching the prisoners with particular interest. He simply stood there, solid as the Texas earth itself, waiting. Beside him, another guard, Mexican. Klaus guessed from his features, tipped his hat in a gesture of casual courtesy toward an approaching officer. The Mexican guard carried his rifle slung over his shoulder with the same easy confidence, no tension in his movements, no cruelty in his face. Klaus felt something crack inside his understanding of the world. Ernst Weber, his friend from basic training back in Germany, pressed close and whispered in Klaus's ear, "They let them carry guns?" The disbelief in Ernst's voice matched the disbelief coursing through Klaus's own veins. In Germany, they'd been taught that such men were subhuman, incapable of discipline or honor. Yet here they stood in American uniforms, armed and trusted, looking more composed than half the Wehrmacht officers Klaus had served under. The processing took hours in the sweltering heat. Klaus shuffled through lines, answered questions through interpreters, received a tin cup and a bowl, and a thin mattress that smelled of disinfectant. The camp commandant, a white officer with a tired face, gave a speech about rules and expectations and the Geneva Convention. Klaus barely heard the words. He kept searching for the trap, the moment when the mask would slip, and the real treatment would begin. But the mask never slipped, because there was no mask. The food that evening was plain but real: beans and cornbread and weak coffee. More than Klaus had eaten in weeks. Red Cross parcels were distributed, contents intact, not pillaged. The barracks had cots, not floor space. There were latrines that flushed. A sick bay with actual medical supplies. One prisoner, a boy barely 19 with an infected leg wound from Tunisia, was taken immediately to see a doctor. Not tomorrow. Not when convenient. Immediately. Klaus lay on his cot that first night, staring at the wooden ceiling, trying to reconcile reality with expectation. Through the window, he could hear night sounds: crickets, a horse snorting somewhere in the corral, low voices speaking English and Spanish in easy conversation. No screams, no beatings, just the ordinary sounds of men finishing their workday. The first week passed in a haze of disorientation. Klaus learned the routines, followed the rules, kept his head down. He was assigned to a work detail repairing camp infrastructure under the supervision of the black guard he'd seen that first day. The man's name, Klaus learned, was Samuel Washington, though most people called him Sam. Sam spoke little but worked steadily, demonstrating tasks with patient clarity, correcting mistakes without anger. When one of the German prisoners, a defiant kid from Hamburg who still wore his Nazi convictions like armor, deliberately did shoddy work, Sam simply made him redo it. No shouting, no punishment, just a quiet insistence on standards. On the 8th day, the mail arrived. The Red Cross had finally caught up with them, forwarding letters that had been chasing the prisoners across oceans and continents. Klaus recognized his mother's handwriting on the envelope before he even saw the return address. His hands shook as he tore it open. The letter was dated 6 months earlier, written in her careful script, full of small news about rationing and his sister, Eva's progress in school, and the neighbor's cat that kept stealing food from their kitchen. But tucked behind that letter was another one, official, terse, from the Red Cross itself. Hamburg had burned. A firestorm in July. His mother was dead. His sister Eva, 14 years old, was missing, presumed dead. Their entire neighborhood was ash. Klaus read the words 3 times before they became real. Then he folded both letters very carefully, walked to the far corner of the barracks where no one could see, and discovered that grief doesn't care what uniform you're wearing or what you were taught to believe. It just comes, relentless as the Texas sun, and burns everything away. The grief hollowed Klaus out, left him moving through days like a ghost inhabiting his own body. He worked because work was required. He ate because eating kept him upright. He avoided Ernst and the other prisoners because their questions felt like hands pulling him underwater. The barracks at night became unbearable, filled with men who still had hope, who still believed their families might be waiting when this nightmare ended. Klaus knew better now. His family was ash and absence, and all the propaganda about German greatness had bought his mother nothing but a fiery death, while he sat safe in Texas, eating regular meals. 2 weeks after the letters arrived, Sam Washington assigned Klaus to an outside work detail. They would be repairing fences on a ranch 5 miles from camp. Contracted work that helped local landowners cope with labor shortages while giving prisoners something useful to do. Klaus didn't care where they sent him. One place was the same as another when everywhere felt empty. The ranch surprised him. It sprawled across gentle hills covered in yellow grass, dotted with oak trees that offered patches of shade. Cattle grazed in distant pastures. The air smelled of dust and dried grass, and something indefinably alive that made Klaus's chest ache with memories of his grandfather's small farm outside Berlin, back when the world still made sense. Sam led the work crew of 6 prisoners, moving among them with that same quiet competence Klaus had observed in camp. He showed them how to handle barbed wire without shredding their hands, how to brace posts properly so they'd hold through winter storms, how to read the land's contours to understand where water would flow, and fences might wash out. Klaus watched Sam work and saw something that fractured his understanding further. The man moved with absolute certainty in his own skill. No hesitation, no second guessing. When the ranch owner, a weathered white man named Thornton, came by to inspect their progress, Klaus expected deference. The kind of subservience he'd been taught was natural for inferior races. Instead, Sam simply nodded a greeting and continued working. Thornton asked a question about post spacing. Sam explained his reasoning, pointing to the terrain's slope, mentioning drainage patterns and livestock movement with the easy authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading land. Thornton listened, nodded, and rode away, satisfied. But the moment that truly shook Klaus came 3 days into the ranch work. Thornton returned with his son, a young man barely out of his teens, who clearly thought he knew more than he did. The son started criticizing Sam's fence line placement, loud enough for everyone to hear, calling him boy, and questioning whether a colored guard really understood proper ranching. The other prisoners stopped working, watching to see how the confrontation would unfold. Klaus felt his own muscles tense, old instincts from Wehrmacht training surging up. This was the moment that proved the propaganda right, when the inferior man would crumble under pressure from his betters. Sam set down his wire cutters. He looked at Thornton's son with eyes that held no anger, only a kind of patient weariness that suggested he'd weathered this particular storm many times before. Then he spoke, voice level and clear. He explained again about drainage and soil composition and how cattle move across terrain, using small words for a man who apparently needed small words. He didn't raise his voice, didn't defend his dignity, because his dignity needed no defense. It simply existed, solid as bedrock, untouched by insult. When he finished speaking, he tipped his Stetson to both Thorntons and walked away to check on another section of fence. Klaus stood there holding a fence post, watching Sam's back, and felt his entire worldview tilt on its axis. In Germany, he'd been taught that such a man should be subservient, less than incapable of the higher qualities that made civilization possible. Yet here stood someone with more quiet strength than any officer Klaus had served under, more genuine authority than men who commanded through fear and volume. Sam led without dominating. He corrected without crushing. He maintained his dignity, not by demanding it, but by simply refusing to surrender it, no matter how others tried to take it from him. That evening, as the work crew prepared to return to camp, Sam approached Klaus where he sat alone under an oak tree, staring at nothing. Sam carried something in his hand, a piece of paper and a stub of pencil. He held them out without ceremony. Klaus looked up, confused. Sam's voice was gentle. "Heard about your family, about Hamburg. I'm sorry for your loss." He gestured with the paper. "Write to your sister. Even if she can't get it now, maybe someday she will. Maybe it'll matter that you tried." Klaus felt his throat close up. "Why do you care?" The words came out harsher than he intended, edged with all the grief and confusion and rage he'd been choking down. Sam was quiet for a moment, looking out across the darkening hills. "Because somebody cared about me once when I needed it. My grandfather, mostly. He was born into slavery, freed when he was just a boy. Spent his whole life being told he was nothing. But he taught me different. Taught me that what makes you human isn't what others say about you. It's what you choose to be when no one's watching." Sam turned back to Klaus, and his eyes were kind. "And because you're still somebody's son, war doesn't change that. Uniform doesn't change that. Whatever you did or didn't do back in Germany, right now you're a young man whose mother died and whose sister might be out there scared and alone. That matters." Klaus took the paper with trembling hands. Sam nodded once and walked away, leaving Klaus sitting under the oak tree as stars began appearing overhead, holding a gift of simple humanity that no propaganda had prepared him to receive. For the first time since the letters arrived, Klaus felt something besides emptiness. It wasn't hope exactly. Not yet. But it was possibility. Fragile as new grass, that maybe everything he'd been taught was wrong. Fall arrived in Texas with cooler mornings and evenings that didn't feel like walking through a furnace. The camp settled into routines that Klaus found himself accepting despite everything. He wrote letters to Ava that he addressed to the Red Cross, hoping somehow they'd find her if she was still alive. He worked Sam's details without complaint. He discovered that keeping his hands busy helped quiet the voices in his head that whispered about guilt and failure, and mothers burning while their sons sat safe an ocean away. The prisoners started a small garden behind the barracks, growing vegetables that reminded them of home, cabbage and potatoes and herbs. They organized a theater troupe that performed on Sunday evenings, improvising costumes from spare fabric and performing skits that made even the guards laugh. It was strange how life insisted on continuing, even when it felt like life should stop. How men who'd lost everything still wanted to grow things and make things and laugh at stupid jokes. Sam noticed that several prisoners had ranching experience from before the war. He arranged with the commandant to have them work more regularly with the camp's horses, the quarter horses used by guards for patrol and transport. Klaus found himself among those selected, though he'd never mentioned his childhood summers on his grandfather's farm. The hours spent learning to gentle nervous colts and read the subtle language of ears and tails and breathing. Somehow, Sam had simply known, the way he seemed to know things about people without being told. The first time Klaus stood in the corral with a mare named Bonnie, something in his chest unlocked. The horse was nervous, dancing sideways when he approached, whites showing around her eyes. Klaus remembered his grandfather's voice, patient and weathered as old leather. Slow down. Let her decide. You can't force trust. He stood still, breathing steady, letting Bonnie catch his scent and measure his intentions. After long minutes, she took a cautious step closer, then another. Finally, she lowered her head and allowed Klaus to touch her neck, and the warmth of her, the aliveness of her, made his eyes sting with tears he refused to shed. Sam taught him the Western way of doing things. Different tack than Klaus had learned in Germany. Different commands, different philosophy. American cowboys, Sam explained, believed in partnership with horses, rather than domination. You worked with the animal's nature instead of breaking it. Klaus absorbed the lessons, like a man dying of thirst absorbs water. Here was something pure and good that had nothing to do with politics or propaganda or the crushing weight of history. Here was just a man and a horse, learning to understand each other. October brought the county fair, and to Klaus's surprise, prisoners were allowed to attend under guard supervision. The whole thing felt surreal, walking through crowds of civilians, smelling cotton candy and grilled meat, hearing carnival music and children laughing. People stared at the prisoners, some hostile, most simply curious. Klaus kept his head down and stayed close to Sam and Miguel Torres, the Mexican-American guard who'd become a familiar presence on their work details. Then came the rodeo competition, and Klaus watched something that rearranged his understanding of the world yet again. Sam competed in the team roping event, partnered with a white rancher Klaus had seen around camp. They worked together with seamless precision, Sam's horse responding to the slightest shift of weight, his rope flying true to catch a running calf. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered enthusiastically, others stayed silent. A few muttered comments Klaus was grateful he couldn't quite hear. But when the final times were announced, Sam and his partner had won. First place. Miguel came in second with his own partner, grinning wide as he accepted his ribbon. Klaus stood among the other prisoners and felt his throat tighten. These men, the ones Hitler had called subhuman, The ones propaganda said were incapable of higher achievement had just outperformed every white competitor in the arena. And they'd done it with skill and grace and quiet dignity that needed no justification. Several white ranchers approached after to shake Sam's hand, congratulating him with genuine respect. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to show that skill mattered more than skin color to men who understood horses and hard work. Walking back to camp that evening, Ernst fell into step beside Klaus for the first time in weeks. They'd barely spoken since Ernst had started gravitating toward the harder men in the barracks, the ones who clung to Nazi ideology like drowning men cling to driftwood. Ernst's voice was bitter when he spoke. "You've gone soft, Klaus. Forgotten who you are. Look at you, watching them like they're heroes. They're still the enemy." Klaus thought about Sam's hands on the reins, steady and sure. He thought about Miguel's easy laughter and the way both men carried themselves with unshakable self-possession, despite facing prejudice from their own countrymen. He thought about his mother dying in Hamburg, while he'd been fighting for a regime that taught him lies about which human beings deserve dignity. "Maybe I'm remembering who I should have been," Klaus said quietly, "before they taught us to stop seeing people as people." Ernst made a disgusted sound and walked away. Klaus watched him go, and felt the distance between them widen into something that couldn't be crossed. They'd been friends once, back in basic training, back when the world was simpler, and they were just boys playing soldier. But the war had carved different paths for them, and Klaus couldn't follow Ernst down the road of comfortable hatred anymore. Not when every day Sam and Miguel and the other guards showed him a different way to be strong. Not through domination, but through restraint. Not through cruelty, but through choosing kindness, even when it wasn't required. That night, Klaus sat on his cot and wrote another letter to Ava, telling her about Bonnie the mare and the county fair and the strange grace of finding unexpected teachers in unexpected places. He didn't know if she'd ever read it, but writing the words made them real, made his transformation feel like something worth preserving. Somewhere out there, his sister might still be alive. And if she was, he wanted to be someone she could still recognize when he finally came home. The news of D-Day reached Camp Hearn in early June of 1944, crackling through radio broadcasts and spreading through the compound like wildfire. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. Hitler's fortress Europe was being breached from the west, while the Soviets pushed from the east. Germany was being crushed between two massive armies, and everyone knew what that meant. The war was entering its final, brutal phase. For Klaus, the news brought a strange mix of relief and terror. Relief that perhaps the madness might end soon, that men would stop dying for a lost cause. Terror because his sister was somewhere in that collapsing Reich, caught between advancing armies and a regime that would burn the world rather than surrender. Every day the fighting continued was another day. Eva might be killed by a stray bomb, or a desperate SS fanatic, or simple starvation as Germany's infrastructure crumbled. Other prisoners reacted differently. Some grew quieter, retreating into themselves as hope died. Others became almost manic with nervous energy, suddenly desperate to learn English or trade skills, preparing for a future where Germany, as they'd known it, no longer existed. And some, the true believers, grew harder and more dangerous. They saw the Allied advance not as inevitable defeat, but as betrayal. And they needed someone to blame. The SS officers arrived at Camp Hearn in late June, transferred from a facility up north that was being consolidated. There were only a dozen of them, but a dozen was enough. These were not ordinary soldiers who'd been conscripted and fed propaganda until they believed it. These were men who'd volunteered for the SS, who'd competed for the privilege of wearing the Death's Head insignia, who'd built their entire identities around the idea of Aryan supremacy and total ideological purity. They walked into the camp like wolves entering a sheep pen, immediately assessing who was strong and who was weak, who could be controlled and who needed to be crushed. Their leader was Obersturmführer Heinrich Vogel, a thin man with cold eyes and a voice that cut like razors. Within days, he'd established a shadow hierarchy inside the barracks, intimidating prisoners into obedience, enforcing Nazi protocols as if they were still in the Third Reich instead of imprisoned in Texas. Anyone caught being too friendly with guards, especially the black or Mexican guards, was labeled a traitor. Anyone who admitted the war was lost was labeled a defeatist. Anyone who questioned anything was labeled dangerous. Ernst fell in with them almost immediately. Klaus watched his old friend transform, saw him straighten his shoulders and lift his chin, and finally have something to believe in again besides grief and uncertainty. Ernst started reporting on other prisoners, noting who worked too willingly on American details, who smiled too readily at guards' jokes, who'd stopped giving the Hitler salute during morning formations. He reported Klaus within a week. Klaus had known it was coming. He'd seen Ernst watching him in the corral with Bonnie, seen the disgust on Ernst's face when Klaus laughed at something Miguel said. Still, the betrayal cut deep. They'd survived Tunisia together. They'd shared rations when supplies ran short. They'd promised each other they'd make it home, back when home still felt like something real and attainable. The beating came on a Tuesday night, after lights out, when the barracks were dark and the guards were changing shifts. 4 of them, Ernst wasn't among them, but Klaus knew he'd given the order, grabbed Klaus from his cot and dragged him to the latrine. They didn't say much, just enough to make their point clear. He was a traitor. He'd forgotten his duty. He'd embarrassed them by acting like the Americans' pet. The fists and boots came methodically, professionally, designed to hurt, but not to damage badly enough to require a doctor's attention. Klaus curled up and took it, protecting his head and ribs as best he could. He didn't fight back because fighting back would make it worse, and because some part of him wondered if they were right. Maybe he had betrayed something essential. Maybe the fact that he could work alongside Sam and Miguel, could feel genuine respect for them, meant he'd lost whatever made him German. When they finished, they left him bleeding on the latrine floor. Klaus waited until he was certain they were gone, then pulled himself up and tried to clean the blood from his face with cold water. His reflection in the cracked mirror was a mess. Split lip, eye already swelling shut, bruises blooming across his cheekbone. But worse than the physical damage was the emptiness in his own eyes. He looked like a stranger to himself. He was trying to make himself presentable enough to return to his cot when the door opened. Klaus tensed, ready for round 2. Instead, Sam Washington stepped inside, took one look at Klaus's battered face, and went very still. Sam didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He'd been doing this job long enough to recognize the signs of prisoners enforcing their own brutal hierarchy. He simply moved to Klaus's side, pulled out a surprisingly clean handkerchief, dampened it under the tap, and began carefully cleaning the worst of the blood. His hands were gentle but efficient, the same way he handled injured horses. Klaus felt shame rise up, hot and choking. "They're right," he whispered. "I forgot who I am. I let myself become confused. I shouldn't have." His voice broke. Sam continued his careful work, dabbing at the cut above Klaus's eyebrow. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "No. You remembered. That's why they're scared." He stepped back, examined Klaus's face, seemed satisfied the bleeding had stopped. "A man who's truly lost doesn't feel pain like this. You feel it because you know the difference now between what they taught you and what's true. That's not betrayal, son. That's waking up." He helped Klaus to the infirmary, despite Klaus's protests, told the night medic that the prisoner had taken a fall, waited while Klaus was checked and bandaged. Then, he walked Klaus back to the barracks, his presence a shield against further violence. At the door, he paused. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. Vogel's kind don't stop when they start. You need to decide what you're willing to lose to hold on to what you found. Klaus lay in his cot that night, ribs aching, listening to the sounds of men sleeping, and Ernst's breathing 2 bunks over. Through the window he could hear Bonnie in the corral, her soft whinny carrying across the still air. He thought about Sam's words, about what he'd found, a different way of seeing the world, a different way of being human. And he thought about what he might lose if he held on to it. His safety, his place among his countrymen, maybe his life if Vogel decided he was too dangerous to tolerate. But he'd already lost everything that mattered in Hamburg. His mother was ash. His sister was probably dead. The country he'd fought for had been built on lies so monstrous he still couldn't fully comprehend them. What did he have left to lose except the one thing worth keeping? The fragile, painful knowledge that mercy was possible, that dignity could be chosen, that even enemies could teach you how to be better than you were. Winter settled over Camp Hearn, with cold rains that turned the compound to mud and winds that rattled the barracks at night. Klaus kept his head down and his mouth shut, doing his work and avoiding Vogel's faction as much as possible in the close quarters. The camp felt different now, fractured and tense. Guards watched the prisoners more carefully. Privileges were restricted after an incident where SS sympathizers tried to enforce Nazi discipline through violence against a prisoner who'd befriended a Jewish American supply officer. The commandant cracked down hard, imposing curfews and limiting interactions, trying to prevent the compound from becoming a miniature battlefield. Klaus worked his shifts in silence, grateful when Sam assigned him to horse duty because the corral offered escape from the barracks' suffocating atmosphere. Bonnie still trusted him, still pressed her soft nose into his palm when he approached, and those moments of connection felt like the only honest things left in his life. Ernst wouldn't meet his eyes anymore. The other prisoners either avoided Klaus or watched him with Vogel's suspicion, marking him as unreliable, potentially dangerous to their fragile order. Rosa Keller, the young translator Klaus had spoken with during his early weeks in camp, had been reassigned to administrative duties in town. The commandant deemed it too risky to have her working directly with prisoners, now that tensions had escalated. Klaus missed her quiet presence, the way she'd carefully translated not just words, but meaning, trying to bridge the impossible gap between 2 worlds at war. She'd understood what it meant to belong fully to neither side, to carry loyalty divided across an ocean of blood and burning cities. February brought news that made everything worse. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces were pushing toward Berlin. Germany was collapsing, not gradually but catastrophically. The 1,000-year Reich, lasting barely 12 years, before crumbling into rubble and mass graves, and a reckoning that would haunt generations. For Klaus, each news bulletin was another prayer that Eva had somehow survived, that she'd found shelter, that she was still alive somewhere in the chaos. The breaking point came on a cold morning in early March. Klaus was working near the horse corral, mending tack, when he heard raised voices. He looked up to see Vogel and 2 of his followers near the equipment shed, surrounding Miguel Torres. Miguel was alone, his partner guard having gone to retrieve supplies from the main building. Vogel held something in his hand, a makeshift weapon fashioned from a sharpened piece of metal. His face was twisted with the desperate fury of a true believer, watching his world collapse and needing someone to punish for it. Klaus understood in an instant what was happening. Vogel was going to try and escape. It was suicide. Where would he go in rural Texas with his German accent and prisoner clothes? But fanatics didn't think in terms of survival. They thought in terms of gesture, of proving their loyalty even in defeat, of going down fighting because surrender was unthinkable. And he was going to kill Miguel to do it, or try to. And that murder would be on all of them. One more sin added to the mountain of sins their countrymen had committed. Sam was on the far side of the compound. Other guards were too distant to reach Miguel in time. Klaus was the only one close enough to make a difference. Every instinct screamed at him to stay back, to let it happen, to protect himself. These were still his countrymen. Miguel was still technically his enemy. Getting involved meant choosing a side irrevocably, burning the last bridge back to whatever remained of his German identity. But Klaus thought of Sam's quiet kindness, Miguel's easy laughter, the way both men had treated prisoners not as animals, but as human beings capable of dignity. He thought of his mother teaching him that manners mattered, that how you treated others defined who you were. He thought of Eva, hoping she was learning the same lesson somewhere, hoping she wasn't being taught that cruelty was strength. Klaus stood up and walked toward them, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. He spoke in German, his voice steady despite the fear flooding through him. "Vogel, stop. This isn't honor, this is madness." Vogel's eyes snapped to Klaus, and in them, Klaus saw something worse than hatred. He saw the blank certainty of a man who'd surrendered his conscience to ideology so completely that no human appeal could reach him anymore. "You are a traitor to the fatherland." Klaus kept his hands visible, non-threatening, trying to project calm he didn't feel. "The fatherland is dead. Our families are dying while we cling to fantasies. And for what? So we can keep killing good men." He gestured toward Miguel, still on the ground with the sharpened metal at his throat. "These men have treated us like human beings. They didn't have to. They chose to. Because they understand something we forgot, that mercy is not weakness." For a heartbeat, Vogel hesitated. Klaus saw the propaganda crack just slightly, saw the frightened man underneath the SS mask, someone who'd built his entire identity on lies, and now faced the terrifying prospect of having wasted his life serving evil. Then Vogel's face hardened again, and he lunged, not at Miguel but at Klaus, determined to eliminate this threat to his authority. Sam appeared from nowhere, moving with that same calm certainty Klaus had watched for months. He intercepted Vogel smoothly, efficiently, disarming him without excessive force, securing him and his companions with help from guards who came running at the commotion. Miguel scrambled up, shaken but unhurt, and stood breathing hard, while order was restored. The commandant launched a full investigation, Klaus testified, knowing it sealed his fate among the true believers. He explained what he'd seen, what Vogel had intended, why he'd intervened. The commandant listened with an unreadable expression, asked careful questions, then dismissed Klaus to return to his barracks under guard protection. That night, Klaus lay awake expecting retaliation, expecting Vogel's remaining loyalists to finish what their leader had started. Instead, the next morning, Klaus was transferred to a smaller satellite camp, a ranch-based program where prisoners lived and worked alongside civilian contractors under minimal security. It was presented as disciplinary action to appease Vogel's faction, but Klaus understood the truth. The commandant was protecting him, rewarding his intervention by moving him somewhere safer, somewhere he could finish out the war without constantly watching his back. Spring arrived with wildflowers and warming days. Klaus worked the ranch alongside 3 other prisoners, all of them quiet men who'd grown tired of ideology and just wanted to go home. They mended fences, tended cattle, lived simply. Sam came by weekly to check on them, always bringing news, always asking after Klaus with genuine concern. In April, the news came that Hitler was dead, that Berlin had fallen, that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. It was over. Klaus was in the north pasture when Sam rode up on Bonnie one afternoon in May, dismounted, and handed Klaus an envelope. Red Cross markings. Klaus took it with trembling hands, afraid to hope, afraid to open it and find more loss. But inside was a letter in shaky handwriting he recognized. Eva, alive, living with their aunt in Bavaria. The words were stilted, careful, written by someone who'd learned to be afraid of letters and what they might contain. But alive. Alive. Klaus read it twice, tears streaming down his face, then looked up at Sam. She made it. She's alive. Sam's smile was warm and real. Then you've got something to go home for. Klaus folded the letter carefully. What will I tell her? About all this? About what I learned here? Sam looked out across the ranch land, golden in the late afternoon sun. Tell her you met men who taught you what honor really means. Tell her you learned it from people your country said weren't worthy of respect. Tell her that hatred is taught, but so is decency, and we all get to choose which one we pass forward. Klaus watched Sam ride back toward camp, silhouetted against the sunset. Behind him, the fence line stretched straight and true, mended and whole. And for the first time since this war began, Klaus felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Not happiness exactly, not yet. But hope. Fragile as spring grass, tough as barbed wire, real as the Texas earth beneath his boots. He would go home eventually, and when he did, he'd carry this with him, the knowledge that even in humanity's darkest hour, mercy had survived, that even enemies could teach you how to be better, that dignity could be chosen, restored, passed on like a torch in the darkness. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin rebuilding a world that had burned itself to ash.